Well, we played through Echoes of the Eye, and I think it's time to talk about how the game structures exploration-based play. We're not going to be spoiling Echoes of the Eye, but we will be talking implicitly about the structure of the game. If that's enough to spoil it for you, go play it and then come back. Right now, most adventure games are puzzle-based, so the player runs into a puzzle, does a puzzle, runs into a puzzle, does a puzzle, runs into a puzzle, does a puzzle, and moves on with the game. I've drawn it as a straight line, but it can get very complicated. You can look up puzzle dependency charts if you want to see how to handle that. But I don't think puzzles are a very good play element for adventure games. And the reason for that is because I think they'll always remain very, very niche. Most players do not enjoy banging their head against a wall, and most players don't enjoy failing to figure out a puzzle and searching online for how to do it and then feeling like an idiot because they didn't realize you could glue cat hair to your face or whatever. I think that you can design a puzzle game that is more fun or less fun, but that's not what I would like to discuss. I would like to discuss moving away from puzzles entirely, and I think that exploration-based play is a good alternative. One of the keys to exploration-based play is that there is no failing. You cannot fail to explore. You might not notice something, but then you'll come back and notice it later. So all you're really doing is a good player will discover things earlier, and a weaker or more unlucky player will discover them later. Both of those are perfectly valid ways to play the game, and it's really impressive how much realizing that you failed to completely explore something is a rush of adrenaline. If you explore an area and you're a smart player and you realize that you can look under rugs, you're going to feel very smart. And then later on, the game will say, oh, did you realize you can look under rugs? And you'll be like, yeah, I did. I'm so smart. Whereas if you don't notice that you can look under rugs, and then you proceed with the game, and then the game says, oh, did you notice that you could look under rugs? That player will be like, I can what? There were a whole bunch of rugs. I gotta go look under some rugs. That is a tremendous rush. And if you don't really know how much of a rush that is, you need to go play Echoes of the Eye. Echoes of the Eye pulls it off several times, and every single time it is like, that's the exploding brain meme thing, right? It feels great. And so this is a situation where exploration-based play is inherently more robust because there is no fail state. There is simply a delayed state. So let's talk about how to structure a game around that concept. We're going to talk about a zone-based approach. A zone is simply any area with an obvious membrane around it and containing a whole bunch of points of interest. What do I mean? This is like a village or an office building or whatever. It's a place, and you can clearly see where the place stops. It's not a place that you're going to accidentally walk out of. The reason that's important is because the joy of an adventure game, an exploration game at least, is in trying to reach places. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the player's urge to reach places to get them to visit every point of interest in this zone before they leave. So, for example, if the player comes in here and then this is the exit, even if the player goes straight to the exit, they're not going to leave because they know there are other places to explore. And the way we're going to control that little checklist of places to explore is we're going to use a circulation graph. A circulation graph is just this. So if we set this up, then when the player reaches here, they realize they can go here, then they realize they can go here. So every time the player reaches a place, they add all the places they can see to their checklist of places to explore. So we do this. Now when the player comes here, they realize there are two places they can explore. So if they explore this way, they'll be like, well, I'm not done exploring this way yet. And we can basically just continue this pattern throughout the entire, location. Maybe like this. We can also get a little bit clever with it because these solid lines represent places that you're likely to go. And in many cases, you won't even realize what the point of interest is that you're trying to reach because it's just a road you can see. You're just confident that that road leads to a point of interest. But we can do something like this, where the player will be able to see over there even though they can't visit it. And that means that the player will add these points of interest to their little chart in their head, even though they can't actually reach it yet. They understand that they'll want to go there before they leave. This is important because it means that no matter which leg the player goes down, they'll realize that the other leg exists. If they manage to overlook one of these locations, we've got a backup, a fallback, where they can see what they missed from somewhere else and realize they missed it. This builds a very robust result, and the whole point here is that none of these places are hard to find. These are the places we are absolutely telling the player exist. We're shoving these places in their face because these are the places that we want the player to visit before they leave. These should be almost impossible to miss, which means that only about half the players will miss them. Which sounds funny, right? We'll get to that later. But you'll notice there are some things here that the player isn't visiting. These floaty things, what are these? Well, these are optional objectives. Optional locations. We'll use these squiggly lines. These are things that you might not realize exist. They need you to be observant or realize a mechanic exists or something similar so that you can find them. Now here's the thing. These are actually critical. In most games, optional means that you miss it and you leave it behind. But that's just the opposite here. These are things where if you miss it, you get told about it later and you come back and you search for it. It's critical to understand this because these are not like closets with med packs in them. These are points of interest that contain something important, and you're going to be told to go back and get it if you miss it. But you don't necessarily miss it. Maybe you figured it out. Maybe you noticed it, whatever it happens to be. These normally connect to these pathways, because when the player is on the pathway, they're almost certainly focused on their next objective, making it easier for them to overlook these optional objectives, because ideally the player will overlook most of them on their first time through an area. So if the black markers, the black triangles, are important objectives, we might add in another important objective or two. We might say this one is important, for example. Now the whole point is, if the player misses any of these, they get to come back later, or they find an identical node later on in another place where they learn the same thing. Either way, an observant player will be able to notice most of these and will feel very smart for having found them, and an unobservant player will realize they overlooked it and just have that head exploding moment where like, oh, I've got to go back and get it. And these can be anything. For example, maybe this is a secret elevator. Whatever we need them to be. It could be backstory, it can be an explanation of a mechanic or a new route or a secret path that's faster than the one we were taking or whatever. But the ones that aren't filled, the white areas, those are areas that the player, if they don't see those, they'll never come back and look for them. Those areas are transient areas. They're places where, it's fun to discover them, but they don't contain anything of value, and we're not going to tell you about them later. If you miss them, then you miss them, which is why it's so incredibly important that this circulation graph be as obvious as possible, so that the players don't miss very many of these clear points of interest, just because if they miss them, then they're wasted. So we want the player to notice them. It's also incredibly important to understand that this circulation graph is not a list of how you can get to places. It might be perfectly possible for the player to make this leap, or, jump from here to here, or through the woods, or whatever. We don't have to keep the player from doing those things, because the circulation chart is not how the player should explore. The circulation chart is our way of moderating how many points of interest get added to their internal list at once. Because we don't want more than maybe 3 or 4 things on their list at the same time, otherwise they'll start to forget. So this whole point is that these things unfold at a very specific rate, which allows the player to explore comfortably. But if they jump somewhere else, if they come in at a weird angle or decide they want to, forge through the forest or whatever, they'll still get those things added to their list. They'll just be added in a different order, because they're going in a different order. Now, it can be very important to control the order in which the player moves through space. Sometimes it matters a lot. And for that, we would use something that I would call a switchback. So an example of a switchback might be if this is a raised bridge, there are supposed to be boats going through, but the last boat was 1,000 years ago. The bridge still works, though, if you can lower it. And you're pretty sure you can, because there's this giant building you can see over here labeled bridge control. And from the bridge control, you can see the bridge really easily. So you come this way, you realize that you need to access bridge control, and you go back and you access bridge control. Or you come this way, you find bridge control, you see the bridge it's controlling, and then you go around. The critical point here is that this is not a puzzle. This is a method to control the order in which the player accesses nodes. The player can't reach these 2 nodes until they've reached the bridge control station. That allows us to control when the player experiences what situations. It's absolutely critical that the player understand what they're unlocking as they do this. I call these switchback puzzles because this is not a method of making things complicated. It's a method of going up the hill by going back and forth. You're never doing something that confuses you or sidetracks you. It's always about understanding that you're going to be able to get across this bridge or whatever the thing blocking you is. If you reach something and you know you can get across, you just have to find how to activate it. That's a switchback. Because again, the whole point here is to just control the order in which the player visits things, not to make them miss anything, not to make them have to solve a puzzle, not to control their overall progress towards objectives or anything like that. This is just a way to make sure they explore certain things before other things. And it should remain as simple as possible. If you start putting puzzles in, then the player can start failing the puzzles. Now, chances are some players will still fail this. They'll still fail to understand that they can lower the bridge. But we want to reduce that number to as low a number as possible. And so with that in mind, we would make these switchbacks very basic, to the point where you would only barely consider them puzzles. They're just a way to make you visit one place first. And I know I've said that like 8 times, and that's because it's critically important. We all tend to get these really brilliant ideas about how to make these levels complicated. Oh, look, we can raise all of the water levels and it'll make different bridges connect up, and then we can lower them, and it's like, no, because the player won't be able to keep track of where they're going. At all times, our focus is on making sure that the player's list of places they want to visit is healthy. Not too full, not too empty. There are lots of ways to do it. I just wanted to make absolutely clear that adding puzzles is not one of those ways. Now let's talk about what happens outside of the zones. If there is a first village full of stuff, there is probably a second village full of stuff. You move here, you move here, you move off to village 3 or whatever. This is not the same kind of play. Now, presumably you are moving through space into an unknown area, so it is still exploration in the most technical sense of the term, but we're not using the same mechanics. We're not using a list of places to explore. We're not trying to get the player to explore everywhere before moving on, because there's no membrane around this place. The objective here is to get the player to the next zone that's full of fun stuff, not to have the player spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's in this zone. So we can use whatever play we want here. This gives us a good heartbeat. We got the zone, and then we got the non-zone play, and then we got the zone, and then we got the non-zone play. For example, if this is a game that's about a road trip, you stop in at the motel, that's a zone. You got the motel area, and then the next day you and your friends get back in the car and drive for 18 hours to the next motel, and you have the road trip play, whatever that might be. You get to talk with your friends and stop off at terrible, terrible roadside diners and find fun balls of twine and whatever else, you know? Or if this is a zombie game, this is where you would fight your way through a horde of zombies to reach the next area. Or if it's a rafting game, this is where you would ride the rapids. But there are a couple of considerations here. One consideration is that we need to go back at some point. Village 1 is probably not done. So even if we get to Village 2, chances are, while we're in Village 2 is going to contain a detail about Village 1, one of those important places that we didn't necessarily visit. It will mention it, and we'll be like, oh, we're not done with Village 1 yet. We got to go back. How do you get back? Does your game allow for that? If not, you're going to have to figure out some other way to deal with this. So what that means is that you're going to be traveling back and forth on these highways between nodes pretty frequently. So the first time you go through one of these highways, it might be quite a challenge, right? A lot of squiggling as you try and figure out what's going on. But every time you go through, you'll get a little bit better at managing your squiggles. And then at some point, you'll be able to just dash straight through. Or alternately, you find a secondary egress, which takes you back much, much faster. Whatever. The point here is that you really have to understand that this is a set of zones that you will be revisiting, and traveling between the zones is not exploration. It's something else. It's the breather, which allows us to have a heartbeat, so we can have the exploration bit and the other bit and alternate between them. And as we finish with our zones and then we realize we need to go back and explore that one other thing, we can go through here faster and explore one place, and it's just a faster heartbeat rather than going slowly and then exploring 50 places. You see what I mean? Hopefully you do. The only absolutely critical thing to understand about the relationship between zones, besides the fact that we're going to have to visit them repeatedly, is that all of the zones contain safety nets pointing to important points of interest in other zones. And that includes the very first village. If you're in Village 1, it might contain, places to visit, and then it might contain like this hidden place over here, right? And that hidden place over there might tell you about a hidden place in Zone 2. Tell you how to get here. And then in Zone 3, maybe there is a not-so-hidden place just right out here in the open as you're passing through that tells you about the Zone 1 place. This interconnected web of safeties is what gives these zones their vibrance. It's what makes delayed discovery work. All of these places are built with the understanding that the player is going to overlook some of the things in that space. And then later, they're going to feel really chuffed to go back and find what they missed. That's the foundation of this approach. So you have to build your safety nets very carefully and understand which villages or nodes are going to refer to which other places and reveal which other secrets. And sometimes it'll be a little bit more missable. So in zone 1 you would have this secret zone here, and then in zone 14 you would have a zone like this. But rather than telling you about zone 1, it just repeats the same data you would have found in zone 1, just to make it so you don't have to go back through 13 villages. Both of these approaches are completely valid, and I find them to be a very robust way to think about how to structure your game. And that's it. That's exploration-based gameplay, a la Echoes of the Eye. No need to blow your mind with amazing innovations, although if you can think of any, you obviously should use them. It's just a really stable way to assemble areas for you to explore. Let me know what you think.